Radhe Radhe, a spiritual good morning to one and all on Saturday, 21st January 2023, where Mummy and I are here to present to you our recap video for today's Bhagavad Gita study session for chapter 6.
Radhe Radhe, everybody.
As you'll see up on the screen right now, we were able to cover chapter 6 verses 43, 44, and 45 today. Of course, we started off as always with a quiz to help recap the previous session's content, which focused on chapter 6 verses 40, 41, and 42. Please do use the links in the description below to take a look at the community portal where all these slides and other information are regularly available for everyone's benefit. So you can look at the quiz questions later, and with that, we shall get started with a recitation rendition for chapter 6, verse 43.
Tatra tam buddhi sanyogam labhate parvadehikam yatate cha tato bhuyaha sansiddhau kuru nandana.
For chapter 6, verse 43, the catchphrase here is wiki wiki, wisdom. Just as we often tell people, wiki wiki, rise and shine in a physical sense every morning, here it is actually this learning from Sri Krishna we have gained today that our inner wisdom from many, many previous lifetimes of spiritual practice gets awakened when we get a special birth. That special birth, as we now see in the commentary, chapter 6, verse 43, is that it helps us then strive even harder toward perfection in yoga. So as a reminder, as we covered in class, here Sri Krishna says, on taking such a birth, that birth is from chapter 6, verses 41 and 42. In fact, in the quiz question as well, the very, very difficult birth to attain, which we saw was the direct rebirth in the earth plane as a human after being a human in the current lifetime. So again, we do want to encourage everybody to go back also to last time's verses and the quiz questions for today to take a look at the different kinds of unsuccessful yogis with varying levels of passion or dispassion, as Sri Krishna says. So then the ones, of course, with a lot of dispassion, they get to take that so-called shortcut we had said last time. But remember, it's not a shortcut per se because a lot of effort is required. Nonetheless, when such yogis do get that special earth plane birth or human form again, then they're able to strive harder. What happens here is that God helps facilitate this spiritual progress. Swamiji has used a keyword here, which is accumulated, which also comes up by Sri Krishna in a couple of verses later that we covered today as well. So with all these accumulated spiritual assets, as we see, and Mummy described very nicely a sequence. Here it is detachment, wisdom, devotion, faith, tolerance, and determination. Mummy's observation for the sequence was to read it backwards, which is you start with determination, build tolerance, have faith, increase your devotion, get that awakening of wisdom, and then also have detachment, which is really what is the attainment of yoga. So a nice way that we encourage everyone to take a look at again, revisit, and hopefully remember. So spiritual assets are preserved, you build up from there, and in fact that helps explain why some people apparently overnight, but that isn't really the case. You see it overnight, but they have this awakening and a change of direction. The spiritual U-turn, as we might say, where they are able to use their previous sanskars, their previous tendencies, and make more progress in their journeys towards yoga and bhakti and devotion. So Swamiji gives the analogy of a traveler, just as you take a long journey and you take breaks along the way, stop somewhere overnight. Next day, you do not have to traverse yesterday's portion again. So it is something that you build up from. The example we had given also was chapter 6, verse 3, much, much earlier in this chapter. So taking us there, we had mentioned Arurukshoho, which is for a beginner. And at the other end of the ladder of yoga, there is Yog Arudasya, which is of those who are elevated in yoga. keep that analogy or picture in mind as well, because in a way, when you get back to that human form, you're able to pick up from that rung or the step of the ladder that you left off at. So two helpful analogies there. And again, Swamiji says that is why such yogis never get lost. We'll next move on to chapter 6, verse 44.
पूर्वाभ्यासेन तेनैव ह्रियते ह्यवशोऽपि सः जिज्ञासुरपि योगस्य शब्दब्रह्माति वर्तते.
Chapter 6, verse 44, the catchphrase here is divinity draws discipline. We see here in Sri Krishna's words that even perhaps what seems to be against their will, these yogis are actually drawn towards God. And the reason for that is their past discipline. So because of all that discipline, because of that effort and even increased effort, we saw in the previous verse as well, they are in fact drawn and attracted towards God, towards divinity. Again, in terms of the commentary, we see that it is to do a lot with sanskars, so our tendencies, our impressions and inclinations from all of our previous lifetimes. And that is what will help draw us towards spirituality. We mentioned in class, in fact, that if there's one phone call you really should be taking, it is that metaphorical phone call of God. Often we hear it in Hindi also, I think, Mata ka bulava, or, God's call, God's bulava. A lot of strength and divinity in that phrase. Many times people use that when they are going to go to a very, very holy place. But that again is a very, very physical manifestation of important, spiritual practices. Here, of course, it's also even beyond that, which is to talk about all of our spiritual sadhana and endeavors, which could be sitting right in the comfort of your home, but with that effort, without, of course, having to go to just a holy place. God is everywhere. So that is something to keep in mind. And in fact, God is here in our hearts. So as Swamiji said again, and as we said in class, well before mobile phones, cell phones, rotary phones, landlines, whatever it is, these calls of God have been coming to various yogis. It is, as Swamiji says, the strongest call in one's life. And again, as we saw, we think it happens overnight to certain people because that's just what we physically see. But it is purely because of sanskars of previous lifetimes that princes, noblemen, businessmen, etc., sometimes give up a lot of their material duties and all of their wealth, and they go greater forward, much further towards that call of God, towards the calling of seva and spirituality and offering everything for the pleasure and enjoyment of God. So that again is a reminder about rising above the ritualistic practices or the fruitive sections of the Vedas, Karam Kand, as we have mentioned before. Next up is going to be chapter 6, verse 45.
प्रयत्नाद् yogi sanshuddha kilbishaha अनेक जन्म संसिद्धः ततो याति param gatim.
Final verse we covered today, chapter 6, verse 45. Here, the catchphrase is merits momentum, or in other words, the momentum of merits. And what kind of merits? Obviously spiritual, but as Sri Krishna now uses that same word we mentioned from Swamiji's commentary, accumulated. Very, very important again, because everything keeps getting stacked upon that. You are able to build off from the platform you left off at. So with all these accumulated merits and now in this special birth, again in the human form, one can make a lot of sincere endeavor and progress. And then Sri Krishna says here, in fact, sort of as a summary of today's 3 verses, he describes to us that such yogis can in fact become purified from material desires and attain perfection in this life itself. So previously we've been talking about, put in a lot of effort, but in case the yogi is unsuccessful, the 2 routes are you either go to the celestial abodes and then come back to the earth plane, or the ones who are truly very, very dispassionate, they'll get to come back in the earth plane directly. Now we see that the next step with all that sincere endeavor is actually purification and perfection. So that yog, in fact, means getting the attainment of union with the Supreme, heading over to Sri Krishna's abode, Golok, Sri Ram's abode, Saket Lok. So that is now what we see here in chapter 6, verse 45. We'll momentarily see from Mummy a few important Sanskrit words and phrases, but the main thing to mention here in this summary verse, in a way, is the analogy of wind, breeze, how that is actually providing momentum for spiritual progress. We had described in class that a few verses ago, Arjun had mentioned to Sri Krishna that the mind seems to be very difficult to control, perhaps even impossible, and certainly much harder than controlling the wind, the mighty wind. Here, Swamiji uses, again, as I said, breeze, he uses wind, he also has mentioned tailwinds, and all that is in fact used as momentum to channel us further towards spiritual progress. Again, reminders from Sri Krishna himself, Aneka Janma Sansiddha. It's not going to happen overnight. There are no shortcuts, but it can happen. It's not impossible. It does take accumulated practice and many, many lives. It does take striving harder than even before, but it can happen. So that perfection goal is certainly attainable. Mummy, I'll pass it over to you now to share with us some important Sanskrit words and any other observations.
So, from verse number 43, we will look at the word Buddhi Sanyogam. Very important word. Buddhi Sanyogam means reawaken their wisdom. So, God does this. When God gives us birth in human form, and if we have accumulated enough spiritual assets from the previous lifetime, then God helps us to reawaken the divine wisdom in us. That is called Buddhi Sanyogam. And then what happens? Then you go for Sansiddhau. Sansiddhau means that now when that wisdom has been reawakened, then as a person, you yourself then would want to go for perfection. You want to go for the spiritual success of attaining God by having more discipline, by having more devotion, by having lots of faith, by having then lots of wisdom, and through that getting to detachment. Then verse number 44, we'll look at the word Abhyasen. Very, very important. Abhyasen means discipline. So what is discipline means? That you try to be detached, vairagya. Try to be away from material pleasures. So keep on trying and practicing. That is called discipline, Abhyasen. Vairagya, leave vairagya and move to and practice Abhyasen and move to detachment. And then how do you do all this? You do it with Priyatnad Yatmanaha. From verse number 45, Priyatnad means with great effort, and Yatmanaha, endeavor. So what happens when those feelings of divine wisdom have been reawakened in you, because God is facilitating, then the human, that person, starts with great effort. That person starts with great effort. He starts endeavoring, okay? Then he strives hard. Strive means yatate, yatate. He strives hard than before, and then really keeps on increasing the spirituality quotient. So, Aneka Janma Sansiddhau. So, this is the effort that brings to culmination. It can happen in this birth, okay? Once God has reawakened that divine wisdom in you, God himself facilitates. But now it depends on the human, that person, that he or she does, Pratnad Yatamanastu, with all the great effort, the person endeavors to really achieve that God realization. It is possible in this birth also, because you have accumulated assets of spirituality from previous lifetimes, and then God has now reawakened in you. If you really understand it and you take it up with full effort and you endeavor, then it is possible that you can realize God in this lifetime also. Very possible. I hope that helps to understand these verses.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mummy. And certainly we all have to be continuing to put in our efforts. And as you stressed again, there's that sincerity over many lifetimes we striving for perfection, and also, of course, accumulated. That is certainly important when we talk about spiritual assets. So that brings us towards the end of this recap video for today's 3 verses. Again, chapter 6, verses 43, 44, and 45. We do look forward to seeing you next time, which will be Saturday, 28th January 2023, for the, in fact, final class of this Bhagavad Gita chapter 6 series. Not necessarily final, because we will be covering the last 2 verses, but then, of course, that means we're getting closer towards the quiz to go through the entire chapter, but almost there towards the end of chapter 6. And before that, we hope we'll see you. In fact, it'll be Republic Day in the US time zone, 26th January 2023, Thursday. That's our Bhagavad Gita recitation series for chapter 2. That'll be at 7 p.m. Dallas Central Time. It becomes Friday, 27th January 2023. In India, that will be 6:30 in the morning. So that is Bhagavad Gita recitation, chapter 2. Here, as we said, a week from Saturday again, Bhagavad Gita study for chapter 6. Till then, continue working hard, and all of us strive collectively and individually in our endeavors and our spiritual travels, as we saw today. Thank you so much. Radhe Radhe.
Radhe Radhe.